Welcome to Engaging Ideas, where we bring information and ideas from the Academy to the community to help think about real-world questions. Today we're going to look at the role of courts in shaping public policy. It's a hot political issue, as seen in the intense partisan battles over the appointment of a U.S. Supreme Court justice to replace the late Antonin Scalia. There also seems to be an increasing emphasis by political parties, politicians, and even the public on getting the right judges appointed, right either liberal or conservative, depending upon one's point of view. Joining me to discuss the evolving role of the courts in shaping public policy is Dr. Joshua Wilson, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Denver. Professor Wilson is the author of 2 books, multiple articles in professional journals, and is a frequent contributor to popular media such as Newsweek, Time, the Pacific Standard, and other publications. Much of his work focuses directly on our topic. So let's begin. Dr. Joshua Wilson, welcome to Engaging Ideas.
Well, thank you for having me.
In the past several decades, we've seen an increasing focus by interest groups, social movements on the courts. So I guess the question is why? What is it about the courts that can be attractive to social movements? And how do they try and use the courts to achieve their goals?
So a lot of people don't think of courts as natural venues for policy, but really they are. They have a kind of a natural role in that a lot of cases are about interpreting policy or interpreting the Constitution. Sure. And by interpreting policy or interpreting the Constitution, you're essentially creating policy or creating the context in which policy or future policy will be written. Right. But if we're talking about social movements specifically, one of the things that's really attractive about courts as a venue for policy is that a lot of times the groups that are creating social movements are outsiders. They don't have good access to the traditional kind of avenues of power, and courts can provide an access point.
So if a social organization, social movement chooses to go to court to try and achieve policy objectives, what do they need to succeed? What are sort of the elements of success?
Yeah. It's good to think about courts and kind of the ability to succeed in them in terms of just resources. And I think some resources are really obvious for people. So you need to have lawyers, right. You need to have money to bring cases. But there are less obvious kind of resources as well. So some of the less obvious ones are you want judges who are receptive. Well, you would prefer to have case law that's in your favor, but you don't necessarily need that. It's helpful just to not have any adverse case law that works against you. And then other things that are even less obvious is it's helpful to have some form of legitimacy within the public and within elite political circles as well.
Legitimacy for the organization.
Yes,
okay.
Yes, legitimacy for the organization, legitimacy for kind of the ideas and the policies that are being pursued.
Okay.
That's not necessary, but it's beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
Other things that we can look at too are framing your cases in kind of publicly receptive or favorable ways, and then having lawyers who don't just bring high-profile cases, but who bring follow-up cases to make sure that what you gain through the courts are actually implemented in reality.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought of that. So in a way, they're buttressing the decision with additional cases.
Exactly. So what sometimes happens with major cases is you get that major case, but then the policy that comes out of it isn't actually implemented. And so it takes a series of follow-up cases to actually implement what you've won.
So when we think about success in this area, I guess the question that occurs to me is, what does success mean in terms of using the court system to achieve social or political objectives?
Yeah, so again, we can kind of think about this in kind of the obvious way and then the less obvious way.
Yeah.
So the obvious one being, winning a case, and then, as we were just discussing, having it meaningfully implemented, right? But winning isn't actually everything. Having a high-profile case can actually pay off for a movement. So here you can transition from thinking about kind of immediate gains to longer-term strategies. Okay. And so even if you lose, if you have the ability to affect the public discussion, if you can raise the profile of your issue, if you can raise the profile of your organization and pull in more donors, that can help you in future efforts. And even if you lose a case, but if it's at a high enough level and there's a dissenting opinion that goes in your favor, you can use that in future cases as well.
So it sounds like this is pretty complex, and it sounds like using the courts in this way can be part of a very deliberate strategy that doesn't happen by accident. As organizations think about this, what are the sort of major elements in developing a strategy that they engage in?
Yeah, so again, if we're thinking in terms of resources, you need to be thinking about cultivating lawyers or networking lawyers together. You need to be thinking about building public resources and intellectual resources. So thinking about your cases, who do you want to be your litigants, to be the public face of the case that you're bringing? And movements have been paying more and more attention to that lately.
So they don't just grab the first case that comes along, they really think about this.
Exactly, yeah, there's a lot of work done in terms of case selection, in terms of thinking about how will this play out in the larger story that's going to be told about this case.
Wow. So when people think about it, or at least when I think about this, I think of the major civil rights cases of the 1950s through, say, the 70s, cases like Brown versus Board of Education. And while the progressive movements at the time drove these cases, your work, your research suggests that this is far from the end of the story. And in fact, you've written fairly extensively on what conservative groups have done to use the courts and how that's kind of evolved over time. I found that fascinating. Could you talk about that?
Sure. As you said, when most people think about policy and politics with the courts, they think about what's called the rights revolution, which is more of these progressive efforts.
Right.
And conservatives took essentially a longer period of time to recognize the value and the necessity of using the courts and building these kinds of resources that we've been talking about. And that really happens in two phases as well. You get kind of secular conservatives marshaling these resources in the 80s and 90s, and then religious conservatives beginning to marshal them more in the 90s and 2000s. And I think the best ways to think about the way that conservatives have been able to build resources is through organizations. So some people may have heard of the Federalist Society, and fewer people will probably have heard of Alliance Defending Freedom, but those are two really good organizations to look at how secular and religious conservatives have really built resources.
So tell us a little bit more about
Sure.
that.
So if we kind of combine the two of them together, even though there are definite differences between them, they work on bringing similarly minded lawyers together. And so people aren't working independently around the country, but rather they can pool their resources and their efforts. They work on cultivating a future generation. So working with law students and bringing law students into a movement. They also work on creating essentially credentialing. So if you are a Federalist Society member, that's a real sign for conservative administrations that you have the bona fides, right? You have the credentials, and so maybe I can pull on you for an appointment or maybe a judicial appointment. And so those are the types of things that the organizations begin to provide.
I guess as I think about this, I begin to wonder sort of, where's this all going? Do you think the use of courts, I guess two questions. Do you think the use of courts by various social movements will continue to grow? And if so, what are the implications for our judicial and legislative institutions, which constitutionally have different roles, but in real life seem to have roles that sort of overlap and meld in a sense?
Yeah, so both sides are kind of, the entire political spectrum recognizes now the importance of courts, and so they pay much more attention to courts now. So if we're talking about what does the future hold, well, this isn't going away,
Okay.
right? And as I've described, kind of both sides have really invested in resources as well. And if we look at a little bit more of the near term, conservatives right now are in a very advantageous position.
Mm-hmm.
They have a lot of political opportunities available to them to try to restructure the judiciary, to create favorable conditions going into the future. But this also invigorates the left, right?
Sure.
It invigorates progressives to kind of reevaluate their resources and maybe reinvest in those resources. So this is definitely going to continue. But as you brought up too, there are kind of legitimacy questions for the judiciary, right? A lot of people don't like to see the judiciary engaged in policy, but it's going to continue. They have some ability to avoid major cases, but they also have some incentives to hear those major
Sure.
cases. And so really this will continue for as long as I can see.
Well, Dr. Joshua Wilson, thank you so much for sharing your perspective on the role of the courts in shaping public policy. I hope you'll join us in the future as we bring more engaging ideas from the Academy to the community. I'm Jim Grismer. Thank you for watching.